Okay. Now this should be working. So hold on. I'm live. Can you see me?
I cannot.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I have no idea if this is working. I am on the phone with our tech support, trying to make sure that you can all see me.
So you're in a video window right now, and it looks like you should be streaming, is what you're saying?
Yeah. Let's see.
Oh, you're live now.
Oh, great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Okay. Hello, everybody. If you're doing any kind of live video streaming, you'll notice that YouTube has set up a few updates, which, as we all know, would make things much more complicated. Hopefully, they're for the best. Tonight, they have made us a few minutes late, but what are you going to do? So, tonight, we are going to be looking at stories from the Magid of Mezeritz. So, we are essentially going through the timeline of Hasidut, beginning last week with the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and then this week we have the Magid of Mezeritz. So the Magid of Mezeritz lived from 1710 to 1772. He was perhaps responsible for spreading Hasidut, because the Baal Shem Tov, even though he was the inspiration and really the foundation of Hasidut, he wasn't the one to go out and actually make it a movement. So we're going to read a few different stories from the Magid that illustrate some general concepts of Hasidut that I think are really, really wonderful and worth knowing, especially for our times. So I'll begin with this story. As soon as one rises in the morning, one should realize that God has been good by restoring one's soul, and the soul now fills the body. By this means, one sanctifies him or herself. As it's said in the book of Jeremiah, Israel is sanctified to the Lord at the beginning. So what the Magid of Mezeritz did is he took this verse that says Israel is sanctified to the Lord at the beginning and said, what that means is upon waking up, the very first thing we should do is in our mind realize the goodness of God in God returning our soul to us. For when one wakes up, it's the first thing that one thinks about, when his thought has not yet been distracted. So there's a power in that first thought. How are you going to start your day? What is going to be the foundational thought that you're going to build all of your other thoughts, that all of your actions are going to have their root in? This is a very powerful moment, says the Magid, that you can actually, make that anchor yourself. You can decide how you're going to anchor your day. What thought are you going to anchor your day? One should also, he continues, first sanctify each limb of the body, his gazing, listening, and speech. That is to say, before using one's eyes, one should draw down the Creator to his eye. And so with regard to listening, understanding, and speaking, when all the deeds one does that day will be sanctified. As it said in the book of Isaiah, chapter 46, verse 10, declaring the end from the beginning, and he will then have a good ending to his day. So the verse from Isaiah says that the end is dependence on the beginning, and so the entire day can be determined based on your initial thought in the morning. So the Magid is saying there's a series of thoughts one should do before arising out of bed. And I want to point out, we already have, prayers that we do upon arising, that are about kind of, sanctifying each moment. We have a prayer, for God giving us the ability to tell the difference between light and dark, God giving us the ability to see. But this is kind of another step beyond that. Before doing anything, he says one should um, bring God into his or her life through a realization that he or she is alive that day, and that itself is a gift. Then before doing anything, one should, he says, bring down God into whatever action one's about to do. So before opening one's eyes, one should call God down to sight, to one's seeing, and then open one's eyes. And in that sense, then your sight is sanctified for the day. Before speaking, one should call God down to one's mouth. And not literally, this is a mental process. And then one should speak. Same thing before listening. One should call God down to one's ears, and then from there, listen first thing in the morning. That sanctification of all of those different processes in the morning lead one to have an entire day where one can interact with God and learn about God through those different senses, through thought, through sight, through sound. And in a second, we're going to see a story that kind of illustrates this major concept in Hasidut, which is a deep desire to be with God every step of the day. If it's a moment of joy, if it's a moment of grief, if it's a bland moment, if it's a boring moment, if it's exciting, any one of those moments should be an experience of being close to God. And so in the morning, when one calls God down, as it were, to one's sight, to one's ears, to one's nose, mouth, then you're inviting God to be in a relationship with you through whatever sense, you happen to, be using at that time. So he says, this process begins first thing in the morning. Before you get out of bed, you call God down to your body. You thank God for your life. You call God down to every limb of your body and to your sight, your smell, your listening, and your taste. And through that, you can be in relation with God for the entire day. I'll read another story which illustrates this. It says, one should always be careful about one's thoughts. Whenever the thought of love enters one's mind, he or she should at once bestir him or herself to love God. Whenever the thought of something that one hates or one's angry about enters one's mind, he or she should at once bestir him or herself to fear God. And whenever the thought of beauty enters the mind, then one should at once sit down and study Torah, which is called beauty. And if the thought of getting the better of someone enters one's mind, he should at once try to get the better of himself by carrying out some act of self-discipline or of benevolence, whether in speech, thought, or deed. And if, God forbid, some anxiety or trouble afflicts, and one should not know for certain if afflicts him, he should know for certain, if some anxiety and trouble afflicts, that this derives from hod, splendor. This is one of the sphirot. So the way God relates to the world is through, in the Kabbalistic idea of sphirot, and one of the sphirot is called hod, which means splendor, and that this is the sphere from which trouble arises. And when he gives thanks to God for that trouble, he will certainly find that the trouble has been converted from dava into hod. Dava and hod is dava is the word hod backwards, and hod is the word dava backwards. Dava means illness or pain. Hod means splendor. We'll come back to this. The rule is one should do nothing great or small until first reflecting on the quality from which it derives and on how one can use it to give satisfaction to God. Blessed be God's name. One should do this too in connection with physical matters in order never to cease from rejoicing in God and being attached to God who is exalted over all intelligences. So this is a continuation over the idea that one can be in relationship with God at every single moment. That each moment is not just a moment for relationship, it's a moment for actually learning about God. So he says when one experiences love, then one should immediately take that experience and use it to love God. For instance, if you see, if you see a family member, a child, a parent, a spouse, and you think about loving them, ask yourself, what does this teach me about loving God? And then take a moment, kind of hone in on that feeling and use it to love God. That's what the Magid is saying. And he says, don't just do it with love. When you feel hate towards somebody, if you feel angry about something, use that to hone in on the feeling of fear from God. And by fear, we mean awe and reverence. Use that, that powerful energy that comes with anger, redirect it toward an awe and a wonder and even a fear of God. Same thing when one sees something beautiful, one should immediately go and study Torah, because Torah is called beauty. So all of these things should immediately remind you of God. Love should remind you of loving God. Anger should remind you of being reverent toward God. Beauty should remind you of Torah, which will remind you of God. And he even continues. He says, and if the thought of getting the better of somebody, if you think that you can take advantage of somebody, he says instead, try to get the better of yourself. Do something, some act of self-discipline to get the better of yourself. And in that sense, you'll push yourself on the path toward God. Whereas, on the other hand, if you were to try to get the better of somebody and tricking them of any, for whatever reason, that would push you away from God. All of these things don't necessarily push you away from God like that one. Love doesn't push you away from God. Anger doesn't push you away from God. Seeing something beautiful doesn't push you away from God necessarily. But what we can do with all of these things is use them to build a relationship with God. Now, the last point at the end is powerful and difficult. He says, if there's some trouble in your life, an illness, be it physical, be it just something that one's dealing with, an anxiety in their life, this is called a dava. That's the Hebrew word for illness or an anxiety. And he says, when one gives thanks to God for these troubles, then you transform the dava into hod. Now the word dava is dalid vav hey, and the word hod is exactly that backwards, hey vav dalid. Dava means illness or affliction, and hod means splendor. These afflictions in our life are also an opportunity to relate to God. And we do that by giving thanks for these things. Now, it's not easy or intuitive to give thanks for things that are bothering us, for pain of any sort. But he says there's a power in it. When you do that, then you are returning, this energy back to God. Because he says, the Magid says that affliction comes from the sphira of hod. The sphirot are how God relates to us, and one of them is called hod, and that's where affliction comes from. And when the hod comes down to earth, then it becomes reversed. It becomes dava, which is pain. But then when we give thanks, we take that dava and we turn it back into hod, into its original contents, setting it right and creating something beautiful out of something that was painful and terrible. So he ends at the end by saying that one can do this, that is to say, build a relationship with God in connection with physical matters of all sorts. And that way, one will never cease from rejoicing in God. So you can use your life, your experiences you have, your normal everyday experiences. That's the major invention of Hasidut, which is to say, you take the normal experience you're having on a daily basis and you elevate it by using it to learn about God, learning it to be, using it to be with God. We'll read one more story tonight. This is the Magid of Mezeritz on prayer. And he's going to talk about the words Adonai sfatai tivtach ufi yagid tehilatecha, which is, these are the words that come before the Amidah. It means, Adonai, open my lips that the mouth may declare my praise, your praise, that my mouth may declare your praise. So this is what he says. He says, when one begins to pray, and when one utters the words Adonai sfatai tivtach, O Lord, open my lips, the Shekhinah wraps itself around the prayer, the person who's praying. And it's actually the Shekhinah, he says, who utters these words. Sometimes when the divine spark of the Shekhinah flares up in one's soul, it actually speaks through this person's mouth, so that it appears that it is not the person who makes the effort, that the words emanate from his mouth, but the words emanate from his mouth of their own accord. When this is the case, one has attained the highest rank. So he says, prayer is unique in terms of our relationship with God. I didn't read it to you, but he has the same story that the Baal Shem Tov gives about, that we learned last week, about the doors of prayer. That prayer are actually each one a door leading to God. Some of them, we might have a key, but for all of them, it's possible to open the doors by coming in with a broken heart. And he says, broken heart or no broken heart, there's one, no matter, for everybody who prays, there's one line in all of prayer that when one speaks, there's a radical dveikut, which is the idea, dveikut is being attached to God. And there's a moment in prayer, no matter who you are, where God actually speaks through you. And when you say, Adonai sfatai tivtach, O Lord, open my lips so my mouth may declare your glory, right before the Amidah, that moment, it's actually God speaking through you, he says. And the goal is for all of prayer to achieve that moment, that feeling that God is actually speaking, that it's not you who's doing the praying necessarily, but it's your soul, and your soul being connected to God in a pretty intense oneness. When we say that God is speaking these words, that the Shekhinah is speaking these words, the Shekhinah is God's resting presence, in our world. And we can't forget that we say Adonai Echad, which is God is one, which is everything is one. So when we pray, when any of us pray, when any of us do anything, in the Kabbalistic sense, this is all God. Everything here is God. But when we pray, it doesn't always feel that way. Praying is an opportunity to experience that unity, that dveikut, that being very close to God. And so it should not be a surprise that there's one line that God actually, the Shekhinah is always speaking in prayer. Because no matter what you're doing in prayer, whether you're feeling it, whether you're not feeling it, it's still you, trying to build that relationship with God, praising God, trying to connect in that way. And so no matter if you're feeling it or not, there's one line where no matter what, God is actually speaking through you. And so the rest of prayer, as far as if you feel like you're actually experiencing that oneness, that is dependent on your mental state. And that is why the Magid starts, he wants us to start our day, putting us in the right mental space, so that way, in every moment, prayer especially, we're ready to connect with God and to experience God's oneness. That's why he says in the morning, it's critical that we begin with a realization of God, of God's gift for giving us life, that we bring God down to our eyes and our nose and our mouth and our ears, so that way each of those senses is a way into learning more about God. And then especially in prayer, in that moment where we are taking a few minutes out of the day to intentionally try to achieve that oneness and that praise and relationship with our Creator. In those moments, we can actually achieve almost a sense of ecstasy in God, ecstasy in God, in that oneness. With that, we'll end for tonight. Next week, we're going to look at stories from Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, and he's going to kind of continue to build what it means to have a Hasidic outlook on Judaism. So with that, Shavua Tov, have a wonderful Passover, Chag Sameach, and I look forward to seeing you first on Wednesday for the Tamnit Bechorot, for our Siyum in the morning at 8:15. I'll see you there. And then, of course, on Saturday night next week when we continue Hasidut.